Chapter 6. Crime. It was the night shift. The boss was upset about something, but at first I didn't pay much attention. Then I understood what was bothering him. If those guys don't clear out of the back alley in 5 minutes, I'm calling the cops, he had said through clenched teeth. What's going on, Max? I asked. I don't know, except those guys are laughing and talking out there, and they're up to no good. I can see that. What are they doing? I persisted. I can't tell for sure. They just seem to be drinking beer and shooting the breeze. When Max wasn't looking, I opened the door to the alley and stuck my head out. There were 4 guys, men, just outside the door. Hey, you guys, I whispered as loudly as I dared. You better get going. My boss is going to call the heat on you. I went back into the coffee shop. Things were slow. 5 minutes later, the 4 guys walked into the front door. They seemed to be in their early or mid-20s. They didn't look as though they had enough between them for a cup of coffee, let alone for the 50 cent a person minimum charge for the booth they crowded into. They didn't sit in my area, but I decided I should wait on them just the same. They might get into more trouble. Besides, the tall blonde was really handsome. What do you have, fellas? As I suspected, they didn't have enough for the minimum. Don't worry about it, I said, and I brought each of them a piece of pie and a cup of coffee, paying for it out of my tips. I'm dead if Max catches me, I thought, but I was curious about the foursome and interested in the blonde. When do you get off work? He asked as I brought the pie. Why? I asked. He smiled. His teeth were beautifully white. Just curious. At 11. It was 8:30. They returned a few minutes after 10, going to the same booth. They had more coffee. I walked out of the front door with a smile in their direction. They got up and followed me out. I started up the street toward my hotel. I could hear footsteps behind me. It was just one person. I managed a sidelong glance behind me. The good-looking blonde was about 50 feet away. My heart began to pound, and I was excited. My latest attachment, Bob, was just too dull. He loved me and wanted to marry me, but I needed more excitement than he could generate. The man behind me was exciting. I sensed it. The faster I walked, the faster he walked. When I slowed, he slowed. Finally, I stopped, and he came up to me, smiling that full, handsome smile. I just wanted to thank you for saving our skins tonight. We shouldn't have been making so much noise. We could have gotten busted over nothing. That was nothing, I said. Max was just jumpy. Well, thanks for helping us, and thanks for the pie, too. We stood on the sidewalk looking at each other. Can I walk you home? He asked, finally. Sure, if you want to, I said, as nonchalantly as I could. We reached my flea bag of a hotel, and before I was even aware of it, I had asked if he wanted to come up. Sure, he said, if you'd like to talk a while. Talk? I thought. But that's what we did. I was astounded. That mysterious young man, he told me his name was Al, merely sat and talked to me about everything under the stars until the sky began to lighten. He made no passes at me. We didn't even kiss. He was too occupied with his dreams of getting together enough money to go to Oregon, buy a place, and settle down. It was fascinating, but I wasn't sure I believed it all. He was too much of a man to be vanishing off into the woods somewhere. When the sun finally appeared over the building tops, he asked me if I wanted to go for a motorcycle ride with him through the San Francisco hills in the early morning. Why not? I'm not sleepy. I changed clothes and away we went. At his place, I was surprised to find 6 men living together in one large room. They seemed rough, but they were certainly polite enough to me, and they seemed to hold Al in especially high regard. They made me uneasy, but that all vanished as we roared off on his bike. It was near noon when he stopped. Al turned to me abruptly and said point blank, "I'm going up to Oregon to take care of some things that have to be done, and I'd like for you to come along with me. I want you as part of my life, and when things get straightened out and we can settle down, I'd like you to be my wife." I immediately knew I would go with him. "If you're sure you want me along, then I believe I'd like to go." "That's good," he said. "Cliff, he's one of the guys back at the house. He'll be going with us." My face showed my disappointment. "But you won't mind him," Al pressed on quickly. "He'll just be with us for a while. You and I will be together." I had faith in Al. I knew he would take care of me. He was big, beautiful, and mysterious. I was in love with him and with the mystery of him. Even if he wasn't precise about what was still ahead, I still trusted him. "Okay," I said, "if that's what you want." The brand new Buick Riviera was smooth and quietly powerful. All my belongings were packed neatly in the trunk. My job, my hotel, my dear dull boyfriend Bob were all far behind. Stockton, California was not far ahead. Clifton was a surly, unlikable fellow. He and Al talked softly and sporadically as I slouched between them, sometimes dozing, sometimes staring into the star-filled night. The radio played good music. The Beatles were sweeping the country. It soon became clear to me that the motives for their trip north was not especially honorable. They apparently had robbery in mind. Both were ex-convicts. My big, handsome, mysterious Al spent a lot of time in prison, it seemed, and was then on the run from his parole agent. Clifton declined to tell me what he had been in prison for, but the look on his face frightened me, even without words. He, too, was on the run, and the rented car was, by then, a stolen car. I was glad to feel Al close beside me. I leaned into his warmth. "I'm involved with criminals." The thought finally penetrated my consciousness. The kid from the green country is running with 2 cons. I didn't know if I should laugh or cry. An inward chuckle finally prevailed. Just like the movies. Sure beats rotting away in that hotel, and my old man can't bug me anymore. I began to piece together the immediate plans. Way back behind my suitcases in the trunk was a high-powered rifle. It would serve to get more guns, which would open the way for a big heist. Then, Al said over and over, "We'll have enough money to get married, buy a home in Oregon, and go straight." My faith in him was so great that I believed him. In 3 or 4 days, we abandoned the Buick, guessing that an alarm was out for it by then. Using money stolen late at night from a gas station, we acquired what seemed to be the perfect car for us. A well-worn, nondescript Rambler sedan, just right for young people doing some camping in the beautiful Oregon countryside. Equipment was easy to steal from the local stores, and we had everything we needed for camping in the woods near a river. Our chosen site was actually property owned by relatives of Clifton. My main concern was the reaction to the noise of our target practicing with the rifle and the 2 handguns acquired by Al and Cliff. They were turning me into a sharpshooter. One late afternoon, we prepared to go to town for supplies, but the Rambler's battery was dead. "What do we do now?" asked Cliff. "Let's go up to your cousin's and see if he'll drive us into town to get a new one." Al replied calmly. It's worth a try, said Cliff. But don't be surprised if he says no. I'm not his favorite cousin, you know. Cliff smiled. Evilly, I thought. We were camped more than half a mile from the cousin's mobile home. As we approached it, we saw 2 highway patrol cars in the driveway. Hold it, Al said quickly. The next thing I knew, I was rolling side over side with another body down a scratchy, rocky ravine. The other body was Cliff's. He had his right hand clamped tightly over my mouth. My hands and wrists were scraped and scratched by the small, wiry bushes. They stung, and I sat upright, brushing the dirt away from them. Be quiet. It was Cliff. Al was nowhere in sight. Before I could ask, Cliff said, Al's gone around back to see what's going on. Just like the movies, I thought. But I didn't smile inside. I was scared and confused. Cliff had a revolver in his hand, and the sight of it brought back his words in the car one night. When you see cops, shoot first. Don't play around. Lying at the bottom of the ravine, he whispered to me, I told you you were in this with us, and I don't think you believed me. Maybe you should have split when you had the chance. It's too late now. You're part of the stolen car, and now you're running with us. His smile was almost a sneer. I still didn't like him, and my fear was deepening. In a few minutes, we heard Al's bird call whistle, and he slid quietly down the ravine to my side. The fear eased. We've got to go, he said in a whisper. They're after us. For a day and a half, we walked north, staying several feet off the road and running for the woods when we heard anything approaching. Our progress was slow during the daytime, and we sat out a lot of the daylight hours. The first night, a strong wind and rain storm drenched us, but we kept moving in the dark. I was ready to give up. You guys had better go on without me, I said desperately. I'm holding you up. You're just gonna get busted. I can go up to a farmhouse and give them a sob story. They'll take me in. Al shook his head. Absolutely not, he said. We're not leaving you behind. You and I are together. And Cliff wasn't about to go without Al. He, too, saw him as a protector. I'll tell you what, though, Al said. We're not getting anywhere with all this running and hiding. We haven't seen a cop car in hours. So let's stop hitting the dirt every time we hear something coming. Cliff wasn't happy with that proposal. They'll bag us for sure. Maybe not. Al was aggressively positive. We'll get out of here faster. They've probably given up on this road anyhow. That seemed to settle it. Cliff was obviously against it, but I wanted only to be close to Al. 10 or 15 minutes passed. Then we heard a car coming. Cliff and I both looked at Al. He kept walking. It was a highway patrol van. The next thing I knew, I was lying face down on the concrete highway with a booted foot pressed into the small of my back. A shotgun was aimed at my head. Don't make one false move or you're dead, said a voice above me. We were searched head to foot, then handcuffed behind our backs. With my head resting on the pavement, I solemnly looked at Al. I could feel a tear running across my nose. One of the 2 patrolmen spoke enthusiastically to the other. It's a good thing we got that alert down the road there. We might have never spotted them. Just 3 miles up the road, they received a radio description of 2 men and a woman, armed and dangerous, wanted on suspicion of robbery and parole violation. Al managed to smile at me. We almost made it, kiddo. 3 months later, 3 months among hardened prisoners in Rock Butte County Jail. I arrived back in San Jose, free on a suspended sentence and 2 years' probation. My father and Aunt Joy met me. I was stone cold inside, and I could not smile, even as I each embraced them. This was not my family, although I agreed to stay with my aunt. The warmth had long ago dissipated. Life was somewhere else. And then there was Al. His parting words echoed in my mind. Don't get lost, Sue. I would probably never see him again. The one I had chosen as my refuge was locked securely in prison. Chapter 7. Break. Just like the movies, the thought stuck with me. Dan the sailor was absorbed in rolling a cigarette, a joint. He held the small pouch of marijuana between his legs and carefully rolled a cigarette, then a second, then several. Dan was a nice guy, medium height with black wavy hair. You'll really like it, he had said in the cheap lunchroom pool hall where we'd met just 2 hours before. It beats booze. That was a welcome thought. Liquor seemed to do very little for me anymore except leave me with a hangover. I was drunk a lot, but enjoying it less. I wanted something different. I watched him intently. He was still young, but seemed to know what he was doing. The idea of the movies filled my mind. It was just like the film they had shown us in high school about drugs. Don't abuse 'em, it said. And it had shown a scene of 2 kids in a cheap flop house, just like the one we were in. $1 per room. A chair and a bed, dark, damp, and smelly. Dan sat on the edge of the bed, and I sat in the rickety, straight-back chair. The scene was right out of that movie. It gave me the creeps, but I sat still and watched. He lit one of the joints and handed it to me. Then he lit one for himself. We said little and did little except inhale deeply and let the smoke swirl around us. Not much happened. But then we smoked 2 more, and the movie scene seemed more far-fetched. It felt really good. I was happy and relaxed. They didn't know what they were talking about in that movie, I said aloud. What's that? Said Dan dreamily. That movie I saw in high school about dope. They didn't know what they were talking about. This stuff is good. How can anything this pleasant be all that bad? Dan smiled. Yeah, it's the same old crap. Don't do this, don't do that, don't even live. He laughed. You're right. They don't know what they're talking about. We spent the whole night in the flop house, but we only smoked and talked and dozed. Dan didn't try to get me into bed. He liked me just for myself, he said. And I wasn't used to that sort of attitude in the bars I'd been hanging out in. I'd been sleeping with one guy after another ever since landing in San Francisco for the second time. 4 months had passed since my arrival back in San Jose, my head hanging and my lover Al locked up in the Oregon Penitentiary. I had lasted less than a month with my aunt, then took off once again for San Francisco. Max had given me my job back at the coffee shop. I had moved into a $2 a day hotel on Market Street. Bob had forgiven me for my little fling, but he was duller than ever. I had reported regularly to my probation officer, and I had hopped from bar to bar, night after night. I needed excitement. Maybe grass is the answer, I said aloud, dragging on another joint and watching Dan's head sink lower into his chest. The early evening was quiet as I stretched full length in the overstuffed chair by the cloudy window in my little room. You're 18, and what have you done? I thought. What are you going to do? The room was quiet. Once again, the full choking feeling of loneliness swept over me. I was cold. You've been in jail, you've deserted your family, you're an alcoholic, and you're no better than a tramp with the neighborhood men. How much lower can you get? My cheeks were wet. I was crying without knowing it. I can go a lot lower, I said audibly. A sour taste flooded my loneliness. I'll show them how low I can get. They think I'm in the gutter now. They haven't seen anything. I got up, the tears still streaming over my cheeks, and changed clothes, putting on a mohair suit and high heels. Everybody's talking about drugs, this LSD stuff. Let's see what they're talking about. The thoughts raced quickly through my mind. They were full of crap about grass. Let's see what they know about LSD. I didn't have the slightest idea where I was going, but I was going. It was 9 o'clock when I walked onto the street. I took a streetcar toward the Tenderloin area of Market Street. I knew the long-haired people, the hippies, the paper called them, had taken over a 3-block area. They were different. I was different. Let's see what it's all about, I said. My eyes dry by then, and my face in control. The area was filled with discount stores, a few coffee shops, and some declining restaurants. A group of the long-haired people sat on the steps to the entrance of one of the discount stores. They looked friendly enough, but I was scared. I stopped in front of them and picked out one person to speak to. He was the strangest looking guy I had ever seen. Long red hair and a bushy beard that was even redder than his hair. He was large, and the beard and hair made him seem even larger. May I speak to you for a moment? The question hung in the air. The redhead looked at me with a placid, wide-open face. Then he looked at his friends, and suspicion crept across his eyes. My high heels and fitted clothes were definitely not keeping in with the surroundings. Sure, lady. He shrugged and rose. He was at least 6'4", bigger than I had expected, but he was lean and gangling when standing erect. He obviously thought I was a cop, but he stepped away with his friends. What can I do for you? I was embarrassed and nervous, and I pushed ahead. Do you know where I can get some of that LSD stuff? Silence. He lowered his head slightly and stared into my face. Then he stood erect again. What do you want LSD for? His voice contained a smile, but his face was sober. Well, that's all I've been reading about and hearing about for weeks, and I've decided I want to try to see what it does. I've done just about everything else, and I want to try this. Apparently, my answer was so naive and my manner so awkward that his eyes, then his lips, crinkled into a smile. But he didn't laugh at me. He just smiled and let several seconds pass. Well, it takes money, my friend, he said. I started for my purse. It didn't contain much money, but he pretended not to notice. But that's no problem, he went on. We always panhandle it, and then it's easy from there. What do you mean, panhandle? I asked, even dumber sounding than I actually was. He laughed loudly, throwing his head back. The others on the steps stopped talking for a moment and looked at us. Then they resumed. Come on, little girl. I'll teach you. After less than 2 hours of conning and begging people for money on one of the busier streets, he took me by the arm and walked up to a flower vendor. He talked quietly to the man, and in 2 minutes we were walking back down the street. He handed me a tablet and said, Here, swallow it. He popped one into his mouth, and I swallowed mine. We headed in the direction of my hotel. As we walked, the buildings and lights began to change shapes and colors. Within a few blocks, everything was changing. We managed finally to get to my dingy hotel room, where I fell over backwards onto the bed and stared around me at the weird things that were happening. I was immobile. All sounds were alive. Noises from surrounding rooms, noises from the street, the flushing of the toilets in nearby rooms, all were vibrant, living sounds. The redhead, his hair aflame, bent over me and stroked my hair. "Who am I?" I asked. "You're Susan. You're Susan." A message he was to repeat frequently in the next 12 hours as I slipped from fear to hilarity and back to fear. My brain was on a roller coaster with dizzying rushes upward and down. "Oh," I moaned. My eyes were nearly burst as I watched grotesque living beings come out of the walls and the ceiling. They were monsters, every color from yellow to black. Some crawled, others crept. Some twisted and slithered, others moved in massive blocks. I remained silent as the flowers in the faded, worn-out wallpaper came to life. They bloomed and withered away to stubs and flourished back to blossoms, an endless array of speeded nature. "It's just like time-lapse photography," I said, or thought, or dreamed. My bearded friend stroked me and kissed me and talked to me. "You're Susan. You're you. You're all right." "No, I'm lost," I moaned. "It's all so bright. It's so fierce. I'm not coming back. I will stay. I'm on the other side. And I'm above and behind. Oh, I don't know myself. I can see myself, but I can't remember." "You're Susan," he said softly, far away. "You're Susan Atkins." The clock said 2:25. The sunlight glared against the dirty window. I was in bed with no clothes on, and I was alone. The room was just as it had been. The walls and the ceiling were the same. My clothes were strewn on the floor. That was insane, I thought. I've never done anything like that before. The hallucinations. What were they? Everything became life. There were things I didn't know were there. Where did they come from? I shuddered and pulled the covers close around me. I saw new things. My thoughts were smooth, not erratic. Those were things. They had beautiful colors, but they were scary. I squeezed my arms across my breasts. I smiled. It was dangerous, but it was exciting. It was an adventure. It was what I've been looking for. There is something there. I looked at the glaring window. Maybe it's God. I jumped out of the bed and into the bathroom. I had to work that night. But there'll be other times. It was shortly after the first of the year in 1967. The country was churning with discontent. Race riots and anti-war protests were rampant. In my discontent, I was moving more and more away from liquor and into drugs. But that night in that North Beach nightclub, it was strictly booze. With Bob far behind me, I was with one of a long list of nameless, faceless guys. Good guys, but mostly the same. Mostly like me. Thriving on sex and the best highs available. About every hour, the lead guitar player in the musical group would say something about our big amateur topless contest tonight, the night when you can fulfill your dream and make it as a dancer. "Hey, and that's for you," my faceless friend said. "The way you dance, there'll be no contest." I was drunk, but I was in control enough to know what kind of dancing they were talking about. You expect me to get up there naked in front of everybody? I laughed. Why not, Susan? It'll be no contest in that department either. An hour later, the guitar player announced, "The final call for the dancing contest." You know something? I said, interrupting my companion in mid-sentence. I think I'll do it. I think I'll enter this contest. It'll liven things up. I danced well. I had done it all my life. My ability may have linked with my fondness for physical education. I was coordinated and could flow with every rhythm conceivable, but I didn't have to think about it. It happened. It was part of me, within me. Fortunately, I didn't have to stand motionless before the staring men and women. I entered dancing and soon became oblivious to the fact that I was naked from the waist up, covered only by my half-slip, which was rolled high up onto my thighs. I yielded my soul to the dance and felt warm, straining pleasure from my body's movements. I knew they were nearly perfect. When the number ended, the applause was loud and wild. Male shouts rose all over the room. The band, behind me, shouted its approval. I won the contest and became the youngest go-go dancer in the North Beach Strip. My biggest problem, and my bosses, was staying ahead of the Vice Squad, which regularly checked IDs among the younger customers and would have loved to have grabbed me. Alertness and an alias, Sharon King, kept me out of trouble with the law. When the heat showed up, I'd be sent out for a walk. The pay was good, and so were the drugs. The apartments were better than dingy flop houses, and the men were just as ravenous as anywhere else. I began work at 4 in the afternoon, dancing half-hour sets with 15-minute breaks until 2 in the morning. This was usually followed by a visit to some other club to dance for nothing until daybreak, hoping continually to be discovered by a talent agent. It was a plastic world of booze, drugs, sex, flashy clothes, and big-time as well as small-time hoods. Money brought anything. It was a slow afternoon, and I considered my first 30-minute routine as merely a warm-up for the wilder things to come with nightfall. I was just finishing when Mr. Garnett, the owner, walked in with a man I had not seen before. The room was quite dark, but the afternoon sunlight splashed through the swinging door behind them. The man seemed to be dressed entirely in black. His face and the top of his bald head extraordinarily pale, white. Garnett and the stranger walked toward me. "Sharon," my boss said as I reached for a wrap and moved toward the side of the stage. "Sharon, I'd like for you to dance one more number." "But I just finished, Mr. Garnett." "I know, sweetheart," he smiled. "But I'd like for you to do one more number for Mr. LeVey here. This is Mr. Anton LeVey." I smiled at the man. His gaze was as intense as any I'd ever seen. Even though his mouth was smiling, his eyes seemed to be black and glistening. "It's important, Sharon," Garnett said. "You can stretch your break a bit afterward." "Okay." I walked over to Tommy, the bartender, and told him to put on my favorite record. "I might as well give him the works," I mumbled to Tommy. The intensity in the stranger's black eyes deepened as he watched my movements. A smile curled about his lips. I slipped into one of my fantasies about Sharon King, the dancer, the sensuous, long-legged, full-breasted movie starlet, the Broadway queen. The music penetrated the lower depths of my abdomen and up into my chest cavity. It possessed me. Garnett motioned me to the small table where he and Mr. LeVey were seated. "She's one of my best girls, Mr. LeVey. Do you think there's a part for her in your production?" "Hello, Sharon." LeVey's voice sounded as though it were in an echo chamber. That was very good. He turned to Garnet. Yes, she would be very good for the vampire role. Vampire role? I asked silently. Garnet turned to me. You see, Sharon, Mr. LaVey has agreed to stage one of his productions here at the club, A Witch's Sabbath. Yes, Sharon. LaVey smiled, his face paler than ever. I'm going to produce and direct for your Mr. Garnet a genuine witch's Sabbath, topless and all. And I think it could be fun for you if you're interested. What's a witch's Sabbath? I asked, first looking at Mr. Garnet, then back at the bald-headed man. LaVey threw his head back and gave a barking sort of laughter. It's a time, my dear, when the witches worship their leader, Satan. It's a marvelous ceremony, and will be very colorful for your club. It's a bit out of the ordinary. I shrugged. It sounds like it. I thought it was weird, but it might be the trick to launch my career. Sure, if Mr. Garnet wants me in it, he's the boss. Good. LaVey rubbed his palms together. But what about costumes and all that, Mr. Garnet? I asked, trying to understand the thing better. Don't you worry about those details, LaVey interrupted. You won't need much to wear. Besides, we will be having a meeting at my house to discuss these matters. It will all work out. He turned to Garnet. I think she will be excellent, and she will also be good for the witch in the torture scene. Torture scene? Again, I spoke only to myself. It was nice meeting you, Sharon, LaVey said to me, turning to walk away. I know you will find this most interesting. I was near exhaustion the next night. The men in the crowd demanded more of me than I was able to perform. They seemed to want explicit sex acts, not merely free dancing by a nearly naked young woman. They equated dancers with hookers. I welcomed Garnet's high sign to cut my last number short and come to his table. Sharon, he said, I know tomorrow's your day off, but I would like to have you join the other selected girls and me in going to Mr. LaVey's house. He wants to fill us in on the witch's Sabbath and black magic. We've got to start preparing. Why his house? I was still uneasy about LaVey. It's all a part of a Satan worship routine. You know anything about that? My silence spoke for itself. Everyone has his own hustle going, Garnet said. LaVey's is a Satan thing. He calls himself the high priest of Satan. He's a full-fledged honcho and that stuff. His wife is a full-fledged witch. They have a church. They have a Satan church in their home. It's a big thing around here. You're kidding. You mean they really worship Satan? It's not just for show? Hell no. They really mean business, of course. He grinned. They put on a pretty good show, too. It's good show business. And that's what I need right now. Something to get us out in front of the other clubs. We can be the hottest thing on the strip. He paused, looking first at the drink in his hand and then into my face. His mouth was set. So I need you to come with us tomorrow. We'll leave from here at 3 o'clock. All right, Mr. Garnet, but only 'cause I need a job. I don't go for this Satan stuff. He laughed. Neither do I, but business is business. We turned the corner, and there was no mistaking LaVey's house. It sat in the middle of the block, with empty lots on each side. The house was wholly black. Not one bit of white or other colors showed. Even the curtains were black. Wow! One of the girls wheezed softly. This is weird, I said. Look at the lawn, Garnet said. It's all weeds and dirt. He was right. Nothing of any beauty seemed to be growing around the 2-story black monster. "What a place for Halloween," one of the girls said. We all laughed, a bit too loudly. When I stepped out of the car, I was actually shaking. "Mr. Garnett?" I asked weakly. "Are we really going into that house?" "Oh, come on, Sharon. If you don't believe in black magic, nothing can hurt you. Don't be afraid." I wasn't convinced. I don't believe the other girls were either. Garnett reached for the doorbell. I expected a gong or a howl or something. It was an ordinary ding-dong. The door opened and there stood LaVey, all in black, his powdery white skin glowing. I felt sick at my stomach as I walked past him. His smile was sickly, I thought. Then I froze in my steps. Straight ahead at the far end of the entrance hall was a human skeleton in a glass case. It seemed to have the same sickly smile as LaVey. This is all the horror movies rolled into one, I thought. What am I doing here? I wonder if I'll get out of here in one piece. "Please, come right into the living room," LaVey said with refined politeness. His manners were exaggeratedly excellent. My stomach sickness immediately deepened. The first object to attract my eyes in the living room was a huge black grand piano. That was okay. But right beside it stood a stuffed, full-grown wolf, and atop the piano itself was a stuffed raven. The fire mantelpiece held a large stuffed owl. LaVey and Garnett launched immediately into discussion of the witch's Sabbath, but I had trouble maintaining concentration. The decor of the house was beyond my imagination. I examined the stuffed animals and found myself shivering. Their eyes seemed alive. "The maypole ritual is a fertility dance." LaVey's voice penetrated my consciousness for a moment. I smiled and felt a giggle. I played that all the time when I was a kid, I thought. How come I'm not pregnant? The giggle choked inside me as I caught a glimpse out of the corner of my eye of someone descending the staircase in the hallway. It was a woman with the longest hair I'd ever seen. It was as black as it could possibly be and hung at least 3 feet below her shoulders, full and thick. At first I thought it was a wig, but it was real. "Ah, my wife," LaVey said, rising. "Hello, everybody," the woman said, softly and seductively. Her manners were as impeccable as her husband's. She stood for a minute, smiling warmly at everyone, and then said, "Would you girls like to come into the kitchen with me? I'm going to prepare some coffee." "Yes, ladies, why don't you go with Mrs. LaVey while we finish up these details? But we'll be finished soon, and I do want you to stay for our evening services. Things will come a lot clearer to you when you see it firsthand." We all looked quickly at one another. I spoke first, and my voice was not particularly steady. "I'm afraid I won't be able to stay, Mr. LaVey. I hope you won't be offended, but I don't believe in the devil, and—" LaVey interrupted me with a wave of the hand and a wide smile across his white face. "But Sharon, we don't believe in God either. But that doesn't mean he isn't real." I only shook my head and followed the others into the kitchen. His remark left me speechless, but my first sight upon walking into the large, quite ordinary kitchen changed that. Through a full glass back wall, I could see a real lion in the yard. He was huge and rather mangy looking, but he gave a loud roar as he saw us enter the room. "That's too much," I said, only barely audibly. "What kind of place is this?" I added under my breath. I backed out of the kitchen and retreated to the living room. "Mr. LaVey," I interrupted, "I'd like for you to excuse us, please. I'm not feeling too well." I turned to Garnett. Mr. Garnet, I think I'd better leave now. I'll be your vampire witch, but I must be going now. Sharon. LaVey's voice was gentle, but his smile was still strange. You've only just arrived. Won't you please stay? I'm holding services this evening. There will be special secret rites, and I'm sure you would enjoy it. It isn't often that I send an outside guest to these rites. I looked right into his eyes momentarily, but I couldn't withstand his gaze. No, thank you, Mr. LaVey. I hope you won't be offended, but I was raised to worship God, not the devil. I must leave now. Garnet apparently recognized the urgency and decided against getting tough with me. Okay, Sharon, you take the car and we'll get a cab later on. He walked me to the door and out to the car. Will you be all right? Yes. I stopped beside the car. I'm sorry, Mr. Garnet, but my imagination must have been working overtime. I had visions of somehow being sacrificed and all that. Besides, I'm tired and need to go to bed early tonight. Looking back at the scary black house, I wasn't sure if I'd be able to go through with LaVey's plans, but then again, what other course did I have? I looked at my 2-inch long false fingernails, painted brilliant red, and my face was something special as I looked up into the mirror. It was eerie, milky white, broken by bright red lips that matched the color of the fingernails and by seemingly sunken blue-black eyes expertly twisted upward at the outside corners, grotesquely exaggerated cat eyes. Jet black hair framed it all. I was the perfect, sexy vampire, ready for my casket lying at the center of the stage. Using care because of my fingernails, I reached into my big black handbag and fished out a pill. Rehearsals had gone well. We were ready for the weirdest show on the strip, but I knew I'd never be able to get into that casket for real without being stoned. I popped the acid tab into my mouth, carefully avoiding any lipstick smears. As the end of the production neared, I lay inside the casket. I remembered very little of the show. I had shaken several people with the reality of my performance when I had risen from the casket and pointed a long, blood-red fingernail at the audience and marked them as my next victims. Gasps from both males and females had sounded all around the club. But as I lay there, I fancied the idea of being dead and still hearing all the sounds around me. I heard everything, the footsteps, the breathing, the sighs in the audience. But I'm dead, I thought. It's so pleasant. I'm outside my dead body. I'm a spirit. I can see and hear anything. I'm dead, but I'm really alive. I lay in the casket so long that I missed the curtain call by 5 minutes. I just didn't want to get out of it. The audience went wild over the performance. Garden had himself a hit. I was convinced he had a whole lot more than he realized. But the night's success spelled trouble later. Gary, my current lover of about 3 weeks of standing, lay quietly in bed as I entered the room. I was still stretched tight from my acid trip and sat down next to him. You're awfully quiet, Gary. Is something the matter? I don't like what's happening to you, Sharon, he blurted out. This whole thing you're into at the club is crazy. It's changed you. All through the rehearsals, I've watched you change. I don't understand, I said softly, not wanting to get into a hassle. I haven't changed. Yes, you have, he said sharply. It's hard to describe, but something's happened to you. When you play your auto harp, for instance, it's creepy. There's a strange sound to it, and when you sing with it, it's like something far out, from somewhere else. I persisted with my soft approach. Oh, come on, Gary. You're imagining things. This is just a job. There's nothing to that black magic stuff if you don't believe in it. Relax, babe. Please, Sharon, baby, get out of the show. You don't need the money. We can live dealing dope. You don't need this stuff. Gary was getting to me, and the room started to close in. I'm going out for a while, Gary. I'm really wired from the acid I dropped tonight. You go to sleep. I'll be back. I picked up my harp and walked out onto the street, throwing a gray cape over my shoulder. The night was foggy. I walked along quietly for several minutes, then began to strum the harp softly. I tripped out again, and was a little fairy playing my music. I sat down under a window and played softly for the whole neighborhood. Strangely, no one bothered me. It was dawn when I walked back into the apartment and found a note from Gary. I saw immediately that his things were gone. Sharon, the note read, I love you too much to sit and watch you lose yourself to LaVey. Goodbye. I sat quietly and sadly, strumming my harp and humming. The show was a smash hit along the strip. Garnet had scored big, but the witch's Sabbath and my total sellout to LSD, marijuana, and hashish, and to sex with virtually any attractive man, landed me in the hospital in 4 months. I was half dead from gonorrhea and had a complete physical breakdown.